Now we go on to Daf Samach Aleph Amid Beis, and we're talking about a case of a Jew who lives not in the same immediate area as the guy, but he is living in a chutzner, in a courtyard, but it's chutzner acheres. So again, the wine is stored in chutzner A. The Jew is living or renting space in chutzner B. That's enough mutter. But in this case, as opposed to the case that we had earlier in Amid Aleph, where the Jew shares a house, shares part of the chutzner because he has his house in the same chutzner, here it's in a chutzner acheres. We need an extra caution or an extra protection to guarantee that the guy will not tamper with the wine, put his hand into the wine. And for that, we need v'husha maftech v'chosim biyod, that the guy, if he locks up his wine in his storehouse, he gives the key to that storehouse, to that lock, over to the Jew, so that even though the storehouse does not open up to a public domain, nor has the Jew appointed a watchman, nor does the Jew live in the same chotzer, but the very fact that the key has been transferred from the guy over to the Jew, that itself will inhibit the guy from tampering with the wine, because he realizes that if he goes in by opening the seal and unlocking the door to the storehouse of his yayin, the Jew might come along and discover him, because the Jew also has a key. And we learned in a brayso, "Mitar yeno shalov kav b'shuso v'Yisrael dar v'yosa chatzir muter v'hu shemaftech v'chosa b'yado." Now, in the case of the brayso that we just learned, where the Jew is again working in the wine press of a guy, but is very careful that the guy does not have any contact with the wine, so that it remains yayin tohar and it's not yayin nesach, then it's okay as long as a Jew is living in the same chutzner. But then the brayso says, "V'hu shemaftech v'chosim b'yado." That's going to have to be a case where the Jew is in the next door chutzner. So again, it's complicated because the Rishonim have different approaches here as to when you require maftech v'chosim b'yado. But in any event, the final conclusion of this Gemara, the way we have it, is that even if the Jew does share the chutzner and he lives in the chutzner with the guy, nevertheless he has to have a key and a seal. And I think what's going on here logically is that, okay, so the Jew is living in the same chutzner and he could watch the guy, but the guy is the only one who has access to the wine, to the storage, because he locked it up and he has a seal on it. The Jew has no way of breaking the seal and getting away with that. So by the fact that the Akum expresses or represents his bilus, his total exclusive control, that means that he has no inhibitions about going in there and putting his hand into the wine. So therefore, the only way out of that problem is going to be that the guy give over the key and the seal to the Yisrael. So now we have two conditions in order to be mat to the wine. It's got to be number one that the Yisrael lives in the same chotzer, and number two that the Yisrael receives from the owner, from the guy, the key to the storage house. Now, if on the other hand the Jew appoints a shomer who's yotze v'nichnas, that in and of itself would be a deterrent and would inhibit the akum from going in there because he doesn't know. Maybe the watchman will show up at any moment. Omer lei Rabbi Yochanan Litano, tni afal pi she'ein mafteach v'chosim v'yodam muter. Rabbi Yochanan is saying, well, if the Jew shares domicile in the same chotzer, meaning he owns or rents a house in the same chotzer, I don't need mafteach v'chosim v'yodam. And it sounds to me like Rabbi Yochanan is somehow changing the text. Instead of v'hu shemafteach chosim yodo, it should be reading the opposite. Al pisha ein chosem umafteach yodo. But again, that's only because, as we emphasized twice, the Jew is living in the same chotzer. But b'chotzaches, if the Jew is living in a nearby chotzer, and therefore the guy is less inhibited about putting his hand into the wine, then also afal pisham aftech v'chosim biyado divrei Rabbi Meir. So Meir goes as far as to say that maftech v'chosim biyado won't help. It's not enough of a matir, which is really a pella that Rabbi Meir is going so far. But only again because the Jew is living in a different chutz. Now we get to the Chachamim, and the Gemara is going to have a lot of problems here because we don't know exactly why the Chacham are dissenting. Osrim ad sheyehei shomer v'yoshev u'mishamer. It sounds like, according to the Chachamim, they're going to be machmir above and beyond Rabbi Meir. So again, we'll see the Gemara, but just at this point in the development of the sugya, we would assume that the Chacham are saying that even in a case where the Jew is living in the Chotzer jointly together with the Akum, we still cannot be matir unless there's a shomer appointed. Or, alternatively, ad shiyovo memuna haba lekitzin. Apparently, the government used to have supervisors that were paid by the government, and they had certain times when they would come in. The Gemara is going to later on change the gears, and it's going to say, well, we don't know when they're going to come in. And therefore, that's when the guy is inhibited. So the Gemara now wants to analyze the Chacham. On which part of the Brisa are these Chachamim commenting? Ilema Seifa. If it's the case of the Seifa, which means B'chatz Acheres, so there's no Jew living and sharing space in the same Chatzah with the Akum, where the wine is being stored. And come along the Chacham and they say that since there's no Jew living in that chotzer, therefore, he's got to appoint a shomer. Is Tanakama Nami Meser Ka'oser. Now, it's a little tricky here. The word Tanakama usually refers to the Rabbanan. Here, the Tanakama is Rab Meir. And therefore, if there's no Jew living in that same chotzer, even Rab Meir says there's no matir, and he goes far, Rab Meir, saying that afal pi shemaftech v'chosim biyada. So in other words, the Jew in another chotzer is not enough of a determinant. The Jew that gets the key to enter into the storehouse, that's not enough of a determinant. And the wine is still asur. So what are the Chachamim adding to Rabbi Meir? What are they saying? You have to point to Shomer. I mean, that's exactly what Rabbi Meir would say. Because none of the other factors are sufficient to create a deterrent. The fact that there's a Jew in the next chotzer over, the fact that the Jew was given the lock-in key, to get access to the wine, that itself is not enough, because at the end of the day, the wine is in the domain and location of the Yaakov. So the only way out, according to Rabbi Meir, would have to be to hire a watchman. So what are the Chachamim adding? They're just reiterating what Rabbi Meir said. Ella, therefore, we have to reinterpret the Chachamim, Aresha de Sefer. So we're not talking about the Sefer of the Sefer, but the Resha of the Sefer. Now, what's the Resha of the Sefer? Here we're talking about where the Jew has residence in the same courtyard, in the same chotzer as the Goy. And the Chacham are going as far as to say that even when the Jew is sharing residence in that very same chotzer, nevertheless, the Jew has to appoint a watchman in order to be matir the yayin. The Gemara rejects this. Rabbi Meir already corrected the brisa such that if the mafteach is exclusively in the hands of the guy, the Jew has no access to the mafteach. And yet Rabbi Yochanan says, because the Jew lives in the same chutzah, that ipso facto is sufficient to create a deterrent, and therefore we could assume the guy does not have the boldness to go in there and do a libation on the water. So clearly we understand from Rabbi Yochanan that the Jew sharing residence in the courtyard of the guy, that's sufficient in and of itself to be matir the wine. Elas sefer the Reisha. Now we're going up to an earlier part of the brisa where there's no Jewish resident at all. The ka'omer Tanakama b'chotza acheres muter v'hush maftech v'chosim biyado. The Chachamim omrim liolamas. We'll get to the Chacham in a minute, but first Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that in a case where the Jew lives in another chotzer, then we could be matir if the Jew has the mafteach. Now, I suspect that this phrase Tanakama here is not referring to Rabbi Meir, because we're going now back to the safe of the Reisha. And in fact, Rabbi Meir holds that if the Jew lives in another chotzer, then maftech b'yado is not sufficient. But rather, we're going back to the earlier part of this brisa, which is in the Reisha, the safe of the Reisha. And there, the Chacham will say that despite the fact that there's no Jew living in that courtyard, nevertheless, if the Jew has access to the wine or to the storage house of the wine because he's been given the maftech and the chosem, then it's mutter. The chachamim omrim, and look how far the chachamim are going to go. Li'olam also achiyei shomer yoshev mishamer o achiyov muna habola kitzin. So according to this, Rabbi Meir, the chacham, are so machmir that in the case where there's no Jew living in that same chotzer, they're not even going to rely on the fact that the Jew is receiving the key and so forth, but they're going to require that you hire a watchman. Memuna bala kitzin. Well, what are you telling me? That we could be matter the wine if there's a memuna who is bala kitzin. We know exactly when he's going to show up. Greyusahu. Why would the guy, the idolater, be inhibited if he knows exactly what the schedule is of the Mamuna Makitzin, of the Mamuna? He knows the Mamuna comes Makitzin. He comes at 9 a.m. on Sundays, on 10 a.m. and on Mondays and Wednesdays, whatever it is. So he's not going to be inhibited. Ella, you have to therefore reread or rewrite the brisa. So therefore the guy is inhibited. He doesn't know at any given time when the Mamuna is going to show up. Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer Rishus Ovdei Kol Chavim Achasi. What is that about? Iboilahu. What's going on over here? Rabbi Shimon Elazar Lahakil Ola Hachmir. We don't even know whether Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is coming to consider the wine as heter or to consider it as yayin nesa. We'll explain as we go along. And this is going to be a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Ziri and Rav Nachman in the name of Ziri. Rabbi Yehuda, the name of Ziri, says mutter, lahakil. Rav Nachman says in the name of Ziri, lahachmir. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Ziri lahakil, hachi ka'amar tanakama. Kishem shebershuso asur. Let's say that the wine that's owned by John Paul Jones, that's Akum number 1, is now under the supervision of Paul, of another Akum. So the wine of John is now being stored in the storage house of Paul. So now you would say the following. The only one who could worship an idol with this wine is John, because he's the owner of the wine. We don't have to worry about Paul. He doesn't own the wine. It's being stored in his storage house, but he doesn't own the wine. So he can't generate an Isra Avoda Zara. But what? Chayshina legomlin. We're afraid of gomlin. Gomlin means that if Paul is now storing the wine, he's going to allow John to come in so that in another occasion, when John is storing the wine of Paul, John is reciprocated, and he's going to allow Paul to get access to the wine. And that's called Chayshina Legomlin, which is a concept that appears throughout Shas. He says the following: there's no concern that the idolater in whose premises the wine is being stored will touch the wine. But there is concern that he might make a reciprocal arrangement. He will allow the owner of the wine access to his premises to perform libation. So in the future, if he would want to get access to the wine that's being stored in the other guy, he'll reciprocate and give him access. Rav Shimon Elazar Omer, B'amed dvarim amurim b'rshuso, aval b'rshus ovek v'chol macher muter v'lo chayshin legomlo. So if the wine of John is being stored in the storage house of Paul, Paul is going to be afraid to go in and do anything with John's wine. That's illegal. And we're not afraid that Paul is going to invite John to come in whenever he feels he like it and do libations to Avoda Zara, because we're not choshesh for gomlim, and therefore Shimon ben Elazar would be matir. So all that is Rav Nachman in the name of, is what's his name? Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Zeiri. Now we get to Rav Nachman in the name of Zeiri. Rav Nachman Omer Zeiri lahachmir hochi kamar tanakam of medvar amurim b'shuso abel b'shuso v'kachamacher mutar v'lo chayshin l'gomer of Shimon Gamliel Omer kol reshus ovdei kacham achasi. Now we get a little bit of an insight into that very ambiguous language that's employed by Rav Shimon Elazar in the Mishnah. And the answer is that we are concerned for gomlim. And just as the wine is prohibited when stored in the premises of the idolater who owns the wine, so too it's prohibited when stored in the presence in premises of another idolater. Tanya Kavosi Rav Nachman Omazir Lehachmir. We're going to bring a brisa to support this last interpretation of Shimon Elazar Lechumra, and the brisa says, "Om Rav Shimon Elazar Kol Rishus Ovikachov Machasi Mipnei Haramoyim." So, what is the addition of Mipnei Haramoyim? That we're afraid that they're gonna make all these kinds of arrangements. Debate Parzik Rufi law. Okay, so let's see what's going on here. There's a man named Parzik who is Rufila. Rufila, I think, means he's like in charge of the whole municipality. He's like the number one man. And Osivu Chamra Gabe Arisoso. The wine, after it was processed by a Jew, Bitara, to be careful that there's no touching on the part of a goy to make it into Yayin Nesech. This Parzak, deposited his wine with his sharecropper, his oris. So Rabbanan Kami the Ravel and Meimar Ki Chayshina Legomlin Haini Mili Hecha de Kab Mosiv Hai Gabi Hai. Aval Hocha Kevida Rise Lav Darki Laosive Be Parzik Rufla is Legomlin Lo Chayshina. See, the Gemara wants to say the following: that when are we choshesh for gomlim? That's in a regular case of Paul and John. So Paul is going to give John permission and access to the wine in his own storehouse, anticipating that John will do the same for him reciprocally in return. But in the case of Oris, the Gomlim Lo Chayshina. And that's what I want to figure out. This is where I got a little stuck. Since he's in Oris, I think what's going on here is that if John and Paul are friends and they live, on the same level, that's one thing. That's Gomer. But here, in the case of an Oris, who is working on behalf of what's his name, Parzik, excuse me, Parzik, the viceroy of the city, it doesn't make sense to start imagining Gomlin, that sharecropper is going to do a favor from the Parzik, and the Parzik later will do it. That's not going to happen. There'll never be a situation where the the sharecropper himself will be storing, wine, uh, or give over his wine to be stored at the Parzik. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Amalahu Rava. Rava says Adarabah, just the opposite. Afilu mandi Omar lo chayshin legomlim hani mili hechid lo mirsas minei. Aval hocha keved the mirsas minei mechape oleis chusei. In other words, in the case of the Parzik, surely we have to be worried about the possibility that the sharecropper is going to give the Parzik access to the wine. Not only that, if the wine belongs to a Jew and the Parzik might be held guilty as a criminal act if he goes in and puts his hand in the wine for ruining the wine of the Jew, this sharecropper is going to cover up on him. That's called chipui, machapole. He's going to testify to the innocence of the Parzik. He's going to testify that this thing never happened. So for sure we have to be mach. Okay, now we're about to finish the parak. Hahu kraka. Okay, kraka is the Aramaic of the word krach, meaning of a metropolis. Davi Yosef Beichamed Israel, and there was wine of a Jew that was being stored. Ishtakich ove kacham davi koi beni doni. Then they found out that there's a guy who's standing right next door to the, to the storehouse, where all the chavios, all the casks are being stored. Omar Rava, im nitfas olav keganov is then chamrashari vilo os. Rava says that whether or not we could permit the wine, meaning whether or not we're worried about the possibility that this Ove Kocham that's floating around, that's standing around the casks, I'm sorry, would have touched the wine. It depends. Is he held in high esteem in governmental circles, or he's just a regular guy? If he gets caught by the authorities touching the wine and ruining the wine for the Jew, he'll get arrested. No one wants to get arrested. And that's the famous tshuva of, Rav Moshe Feinstein, that we can rely on inspection in Cholav Akum, because if they mix in pig's milk, they'll get arrested, or whatever, they'll get, the license revoked, etc., penalized. Is then Chamar Shari. But Elo, if he is connected up above with the higher authorities in that place, and therefore they will not take any legal action against him and lock him up in jail, so he's not inhibited. Therefore, we have to be worried that this guy is going to feel carte blanche without looking over his shoulder and being inhibited, that he could touch the wine. We have to prohibit the wine. So again, just to summarize, if he fears prosecution for touching the wine, then it's permitted. We assume he would not touch it. If he does not fear prosecution, in other words, he won't be, since he has these ties up to the government, therefore the judges will not punish him as a thief, is then the wine is prohibited. Rashi, in a very atypical way, offers a maskana devilsa, a summary of some of the points of the last sugya, or the last parak. So first of all, in a case where the Ovei Kochavim intentionally touches or mixes the wine, even though we don't have any proof, any indication that he intended dafka with a kavana lenasech, nevertheless, the wine is yayin nesech, and it's also even behana. If, on the other hand, the akum touches the wine bishogeg, meaning unintentionally, he doesn't even know that it's wine, he thinks it's beer, then it's permitted for hana, but asur bishsia because he touched the wine. If, let's say, the akum touches the wine for the purpose of grasping something else, the Gemara had a case where he thrust his hand into the wine in order to grab onto an esrog that was sinking, that is unintentional touching, and again, it's muter behano, also b'shti. Now, if on the other hand, the akum intentionally touches the wine, but through another object like a stick, and his purpose had nothing to do with nisuch. Let's say he was measuring the depth of the wine. There was a hornet that got stuck in the wine and he wanted to flick it out. In all those cases, it's muter ba'ano. And that was the Mishnah back on Daf Sama. Now, if his intention is unclear, then the wine is prohibited even for ano. So again, if we know that he did not intend to do any nisuch, then the wine is muter ba'ano. But if we don't know one way or the other, then it's asur ba'ano. Now, if the akum propels the wine with his force, let's say, for example, he pours it from a container, or a force propelled by it, an akum touches the wine, let's say he pours water into the wine to dilute the wine, then if the force is still connected to the akum, right, he pours the wine or pours the water in an uninterrupted stream, and he knows that the beverage is wine, then it's prohibited even for hana. If, on the other hand, the akum is unaware that the beverage propelled or agitated by his force is wine, it is permitted even for shasia. When the force is not connected to the akum, let's say he throws something into a bar and he releases it before it reaches the wine is permitted even for shasia. Okay, this is where we'll Hadron Alecha Perek Rabbi Yishmael.